In June 1924, a Harvard scientist handed a New Jersey company a report about the young women working in its factory. It said they were being poisoned by the material they handled and listed what the company needed to change. Less than a year later, the New Jersey Department of Labor was holding a copy of that report under the same scientist's name. In that version, every girl was in perfect condition. Same investigation, same author, opposite conclusion. This is the story of what happened in between. The factory was in Orange, New Jersey, and the work was painting watch dials. Radium in the paint made the numbers glow in the dark, which was what the Army wanted. The numerals were small, and camel hair brushes lost their point after a few strokes. The quickest way to bring it back was to draw the brush between your lips. Lip, dip, paint. 250 dials a shift at a penny and a half each. Better money than most of these women's fathers earned. Radium in 1917 was a wonder, not a warning. When the painters asked whether it was safe, they were told it was. One of them was Amelia Maggia. Everyone called her Molly. In 1921, one of her teeth began to ache. Her dentist pulled it, and the socket didn't close. It ulcerated. He pulled another, and the same thing happened. Over the following months, the infection worked through her jaw, and the bone went soft until her dentist, Joseph Kneff, lifted her lower jawbone out of her mouth. Not surgery. It came away in his fingers. Kneff said later that before she died, he'd begun to suspect she'd picked up something at work. He was a dentist. Nobody had to listen to him. Molly died in September 1922, bleeding from her mouth. She was 24. Her death certificate gave the cause as syphilis, and her family carried that for years. Radium wasn't handled casually everywhere in that company. In the laboratory, chemists worked behind lead screens with tongs and sometimes masks. Concentrated radium was known to burn skin and had been since the Curies. In another room, painters were putting it in their mouths a few hundred times a day. That gap is not proof anyone expected the women to die. In 1917, the science genuinely separated a large external dose known to be dangerous from a swallowed speck, which almost nobody had studied. So the useful question isn't what the company knew in 1917. It's what it did once it could no longer avoid finding out. By 1924, there was a pattern the company couldn't ignore. Former painters were dying in their 20s, and city health officials had started asking why. So the president of U.S. Radium, Arthur Roeder, hired Cecil Drinker of the Harvard School of Public Health to find out what was happening. A defensible decision. Dust in the workroom glowed in a dark room. So did chairs nobody had been sitting in. So did the painters. Hair, hands, dresses, underclothes. One woman was luminous down her back nearly to the waist. Blood results across the workforce were abnormal. In June, Drinker gave Roeder the answer he had paid for. The radium was doing this, and here is what you change. Roeder rejected it. He blamed an infection contracted outside the factory. He said he had another report contradicting Harvard's and refused to let Drinker see it. When Drinker moved to publish, the company's lawyers threatened him. Why he refused is the story. The usual explanation is money. It doesn't survive the arithmetic. Drinker's fix was cheap. Stop the lip pointing, ventilate the room. When companies eventually did those things, painters stopped being poisoned. The expensive thing was never the remedy. It was the admission. By the summer of 1924, women were already dead. Accepting Drinker's report meant accepting that those deaths belonged to the company and that every woman who'd worked in that room had a claim. The cheaper the fix looked, the worse it looked to have skipped it. Another course existed because another company took it. Waterbury Clock in Connecticut quietly paid around $90,000 between 1926 and 1936 for 16 sick painters. Privately, admitting nothing with no lawyer on the women's side. Not decency, a different calculation about what silence was worth. U.S. Radium's calculation ran through a courtroom. In 1925, it put Frederick Flynn of Columbia's Institute of Public Health in front of its workers. He examined dial painters and pronounced them well. He told Grace Fryer, by then seriously ill, that her health was as good as his own. Flynn was not a licensed physician, and he was working for the radium industry. In December 1926, he published the conclusion that dial painting carried no hazard at all. Now, set that against New Jersey law. Radium poisoning wasn't a compensable occupational disease there, so a sick woman had to sue. And she had 2 years from the injury to do it. No allowance for an illness that took years to surface. Every month, a dying woman spent believing she was healthy was a month closer to having no case at all. What broke it open wasn't a regulator. In April 1925, Alice Hamilton, Harvard's authority on industrial poisons, wrote to Catherine Drinker, Cecil's wife and co-author, with a rumor. The Department of Labor had a copy of their report, and in it, every girl was in perfect condition. Hamilton put it as a question. Could Roeder really have issued a forged report in their name? Accounts still differ on how that document came to exist. What isn't disputed is that the state was working from a version of Harvard's findings that reversed them. The Drinkers published the original. Then, in October 1927, men dug Molly Maggia out of the ground. Her bones were laid on photographic plates in a dark room, no camera, no light, and they exposed the film themselves. Radium behaves like calcium. The body files it into bone and keeps it. Paper can be rewritten. That couldn't. Grace Fryer decided to sue in 1925 and spent 2 years finding a lawyer. By the time the case reached a hearing in January 1928, none of the 5 women could raise an arm to take the oath. That April, the company asked to postpone until September because its expert witnesses had summer travel booked. The judge agreed. They settled in June. $10,000 each, $600 a year for life, medical bills covered, no admission of fault. Weeks later, their lawyer learned that the judge who brokered it held stock in U.S. Radium, and in Ottawa, Illinois, the Radium Dial Company had been testing its own painters since 1925 without telling them the results. They had watched New Jersey and taken a lesson from it. The evidence outlasted the argument. Harrison Martland, the Essex County medical examiner, built tests nobody had needed before, measuring radioactivity in a living person's breath, letting the dead expose their own photographs, and in 1925 named radium poisoning an occupational disease. 16 years later, working from data on these women, the physicist Robley Evans set the first limit on how much radioactivity a human body should carry, 1/10 of a microgram. Months later, the United States began building an atomic bomb, and that figure became the basis for protecting the men who handled plutonium. Grace Fryer died in 1933. She was 34. Nobody in 1917 knew what a swallowed speck of radium did to a jawbone. That ignorance was real, and it isn't the damning part. The decision is narrower and colder. A company asked the right question, got a clear answer, and treated it as a legal exposure rather than a medical finding. It never needed to prove Drinker wrong. It only needed the question to stay open longer than the women had left. It nearly worked because nobody was required to check. What stopped it was a letter between 2 women about a rumor.